rulings of a judiciary, the cease and desist orders from a judge, I mean, that's lawlessness on his own part. If it were me, a Republican, I'd expect to be impeached. You can't have cabinet secretaries that just decide to do whatever the heck they want to do. The Committee on Homeland Security has made every effort to ensure that this investigation was thorough. We do not take this lightly. The Homeland Security Committee spent almost a year, countless hours. We held 10 hearings. We heard from 24 witnesses, released 5 reports totaling 300 pages. We conducted numerous transcribed interviews, border chiefs, multiple visits to the border to see for ourselves. I don't hold any personal animosity towards Secretary Mayorkas, but I sure as hell don't want to see him continue as Secretary of Homeland Security, not after the pain and turmoil and chaos his policies have inflicted on the American people. And when congressional oversight demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that executive branches are neglecting their duty, overstepping their authority, ignoring laws passed by Congress, it is our duty to act, to defend this institution, to defend the Constitution. Also, just to be clear, this is the responsibility of Congress. The Supreme Court made it clear in United States versus Texas, according to the court, and I quote, "Even though the federal courts lack Article III jurisdiction over the suit, other forums remain open for examining the executive branch's arrest policies. For example, Congress poses an array of tools to analyze and influence these policies. Those are political checks for a political process," end quote. So not only do these proceedings have the support of the House, the Supreme Court has pointed to impeachment as a source of relief for states suffering a border crisis put together, orchestrated by a secretary who is violating the laws passed by Congress and disregarding the court's orders. Now, before I end, I'd like to address a few other things my Democrat colleagues have said. Let me start with saying I'm very disappointed in the ranking member for misquoting me. He claimed that I wrote that I will not support another dime to DHS. This is inaccurate. What I wrote was I will not support another dime to DHS until the policies of H.R. 2 are signed into law and enforced by the administration. And we're talking about the supplemental. So we're not talking about the budget, which has already gone through and passed the House. We're talking about additional dollars in a supplemental. So to suggest that I would defund the Department of Homeland Security is disingenuous at best. I can tell you there have been a lot of Democrats who've said defund ICE and defund the police. I never said defund Homeland Security. And I'd also like to address the claim that Secretary Mayorkas isn't at fault here, that he isn't to blame for the economic crisis in Latin America. I agree. But poverty in Latin America is nothing too new. And actually, poverty rates in Latin America have stayed flat from last administration to this one. Further, I'd like to reiterate the Democrats sent these articles to impeachment to our committee in November. They sent it to this committee. The Homeland Security Committee has the authority of the House to conduct these impeachment proceedings, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Democrats can bring up a New York Times popcorn story all they want to. They keep talking about MAGA Republicans and former President Trump this and that. But it's clear these are deflections because they have no answers for the piss-poor performance of Secretary Mayorkas and his policies. And let me just point out, my Democrat colleagues are quick to talk about kids in cages under Trump, but did a single one of them mention the 85,000 missing UACs under President Biden? Of course not. The hypocrisy in this room is palpable. And of course, our guide should always be the intent of the framers of our Constitution, the Founding Fathers, regarding how Constitution was intended to be understood. But too often in political debates, people can fall into inconsistency for possibly partisan reasons. I get that. For example, Professor Bowman wrote a book on impeachment in 2019 called High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. In it, he states the power of the House to impeach cabinet secretaries, quote, remains important as a signal of legislative displeasure with administrative personnel and policy, end quote. Yet today, he's testified on multiple occasions that policy alone isn't enough for an impeachment. That's what Professor Bowman wrote when Donald Trump was president, but now, in his written testimony at page 3, he writes that impeachment, and I quote, should not be attempted based on simple policy disagreements between Congress and the executive branch, end quote. I guess that was then and this is now. But let me be clear, no one is supporting impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas over policy differences. The impeachable offenses relate to violations of the law. Insisting on enforcing the law as written by Congress is not a policy difference. It is a fundamental requirement of the Constitution. Lastly, I got to tell you, I was appalled from someone on the left who suggested this has all been a waste of time. We're here today because it is our duty to provide oversight and hold the executive branch accountable. And yes, this includes the option to impeach. We cannot allow a cabinet secretary to violate the laws, disregard the constitutional structure, lie to Congress under oath, all to massive harm to the Americans, and do nothing about it. And if a Republican were head of DHS and committing these same acts, I can assure you we wouldn't tolerate it from them either. It is the Homeland Security Committee's responsibility to provide oversight of DHS. This is what we were elected to do. This is what we were appointed to this committee for. Now, this might not be how you want to spend your time, but it certainly is how we must be spending our time. And I ask the members here today, in fighting to stop the needless death of children to fentanyl poisoning, a waste of time? Is it a waste of time to try to protect those kids? Is trying to stop criminal cartels from wreaking havoc on the country a waste of time? It's not. And the insinuation is appalling. What has been a waste of time, the amount of taxpayer dollars this border crisis has cost, the amount of people who have died as a result of fentanyl flowing across our southern border, the amount of migrants who've lost their lives making the dangerous journey, the amount of money state and local governments have had to spend cleaning up Secretary Mayorkas' mess. This is where the real waste has been, not these official proceedings. As we continue these proceedings in the coming days, it's important that the American people remember the facts and that this body once again embraces our constitutional responsibilities. When I took that oath as a young boy on the plane at West Point, it meant something to me then. And when I took it when the people of Tennessee sent me up here, it meant just as much, if not more. We will support the basic tenets of that document, and that is Congress writes the laws, the president executes those laws, the judiciary interprets those laws, and they have a responsibility to do their duty, and we do also. Without objection, that ends my closing statement, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned. I declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony on President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' open border policies and how these failed policies have had profound and devastating impact throughout the country. This is the first hearing in this committee's impeachment proceedings regarding Secretary Mayorkas. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning. Today is a solemn occasion as this committee begins official impeachment proceedings in the matter of Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas and his handling of America's borders since taking office in February 2021. I wish we weren't sitting here today. I wish these proceedings were not necessary. I wish our southwest border was secure. I wish that our government was enforcing the laws passed by the Congress and doing its job to keep the American people safe. Unfortunately, Secretary Mayorkas has done none of these things. For almost a year, the House Committee on Homeland Security has conducted a comprehensive investigation into the causes, costs, and consequences of the unprecedented crisis at our southwest border. Our evidence makes it clear. Secretary Mayorkas is the architect of the devastation that we have witnessed for nearly 3 years. The findings of our investigation, available to the public at homeland.house.gov, coupled with the Secretary's refusal to change course on the reckless decisions facilitating this crisis, have left us with no reasonable alternative than to pursue the possibility of impeachment. The Secretary's actions have brought us here today, not ours. Since early 2021, we've watched in disbelief as historic numbers of inadmissible aliens have poured across our borders, both at official ports of entry and illegally crossing the thousands of miles of our borders. On Secretary Mayorkas' watch, Customs and Border Protection has recorded more than 8.1 million encounters at America's borders, including more than 6.7 million at our southwest border alone. For comparison, CBP recorded just over 3 million encounters nationwide from fiscal year 2017 to 2020. Jay Johnson, President Obama's former DHS secretary, previously said that 1,000 encounters a day, quote, overwhelms the system, end quote. On Secretary Mayorkas' watch, encounters have never averaged less than 3,000 per day, even going as high as 10 to 12,000 per day. Just a few days ago, internal CBP numbers leaked to the media showed another 302,000 encounters at the southwest border alone in December. By far an all-time record. That's nearly enough people to fill the Rose Bowl 3 times in just 1 month. In addition to these catastrophic numbers of the record 1.8 million known gotaways who've entered the country on Secretary Mayorkas' watch, individuals that Border Patrol agents know slip across our border, but are not apprehended in large part because the cartels overwhelm the agents with large groups of coyote, paid, and escorted migrants. The agents see them and they count them, but they cannot apprehend them. But the numbers are most certainly far worse. As agents are moved to crossing sites to process migrants and the border is completely unmanned, there are no agents present to count the known gotaways. The number of unknown gotaways is no doubt enormous. Thousands of agents have been pulled off the front lines to process and release into our country record numbers of illegal aliens who know they will be released into the country and given a free bus or plane ticket to the city of their choice. I ask you to watch this video.
A border shutdown in El Paso, Texas, as hundreds force their way onto the Paso del Norte International Bridge.
Title 42 has officially expired. Homeland Security officials say illegal border crossings topped 10,000 per day this week, the highest levels ever.
Thousands of migrants in central Mexico continue to travel on freight trains and travel all the way to the southern border, arriving here in Eagle Pass.
Outnumbered and out-resourced, Border Patrol agents say they are struggling to keep up with this massive influx of migrants descending on our southern border.
Border Patrol clearly does not have the manpower to process the thousands of migrants here. So the situation is pretty dire.
Hundreds upon hundreds of adult men who have crossed illegally, waiting here in the Arizona sun for Border Patrol to apprehend them, and they hope be released into the United States somewhere.
Sources telling News Nation that agents have been pulled from nearby checkpoints to assist in processing the thousands of migrants crossing into Eagle Pass every day.
And this is all by design. The smugglers realize that this particular area is vulnerable.
What Americans must understand today is that these historic numbers, the chaos you just saw on the screen, are the result of a much deeper problem. And that problem is not instability in other countries. It's not poverty. It's not climate change. It's not supposedly broken immigration system. All of these excuses have long predated Secretary Mayorkas' tenure, and yet we've never experienced a crisis like this. As even the New York Times admits, and I quote, push factors don't explain the entire surge, and maybe not even most of it. There have been no recent wars in Latin America, and the region's poverty rate has been flat, end quote, the New York Times. I'll also note that 2 of the 16 cities in the world with the highest murder rates are right here in the United States. No, this crisis has been intentional. Secretary Mayorkas was made aware of testimony given by President Biden's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, where the AG admitted the current policies are being exploited by the cartels. Yet Secretary Mayorkas turns around and implements additional policies to expand the catch and release measures, empowering the cartels and killing Americans. After nearly 3 years of watching this unfold, what other conclusion is there but this is an intentional crisis? Secretary Mayorkas has brazenly refused to enforce the laws passed by Congress and enacted policies that knowingly make our country less safe. What we're seeing here is a willful violation of his oath of office taken by Secretary Mayorkas. Let me repeat that, a willful violation. Secretary Mayorkas has used mass parole to release more than 1.5 million inadmissible aliens into the country, despite the Immigration and Nationality Act stating that parole is to be used only as an, I quote, case by case, end quote, and, quote, temporary basis for a, quote, significant benefit or urgent humanitarian reason, end quote. The Chief Patrol Agent of the Border Patrol's Laredo sector told us last June that historically parole, and I quote, was used only in extreme humanitarian instances. If a child was sick, had to go to the hospital, we'd parole the parent or something like that. But that was very rare. It wasn't an everyday thing, end quote. This Porter chief is right. The scale of Secretary Mayorkas' mass use and abuse of parole is unprecedented and has been declared inconsistent with the laws passed by Congress by multiple federal judges, but remains a central component of Secretary's agenda. The Immigration and Nationality Act also requires that illegal aliens apprehended crossing the border be detained pending their removal proceedings. Secretary Mayorkas has ignored this law. In fiscal year 2013, according to DHS's own numbers, the Obama administration detained 82% of illegal aliens from the moment they were encountered until their case was decided, and another 9% were held for at least some portion of time after that. That's a pretty good track record, and under a Democrat administration. In Secretary Mayorkas' first year on the job, that 82% number dropped to just 10%. Illegal aliens not detained at all jumped from 9% to 64% in FY21. In a court opinion earlier this year, federal judge Kent Wetherell wrote, and I quote, "The evidence establishes that in late January or early February of 2021, DHS made a discrete change in detention policy from release only if there is a compelling reason to release unless there is a compelling reason not to," end quote. The deputy chief of the Border Patrol's Yuma sector told our committee in September, quote, "The belief that they are going to be released with no consequences is certainly something that many migrants tell our agents," end quote. On Secretary Mayorkas' watch, that's a pretty good bet. And under his leadership, individuals guilty of violent crimes and even some of on the terrorist watch list have been released into this country. Just Monday, multiple sources confirmed Secretary Mayorkas admitted that released rates of illegal aliens are currently around 85%. All told, DHS numbers indicate that well over 3 million inadmissible aliens have been released into our country on Secretary Mayorkas' watch. Factor in the 1.8 million known gotaways, the unqualifiable unknown gotaways, that's roughly the population of the state of South Carolina. Not only has Secretary Mayorkas refused to detain these individuals in accordance with the law, but he has also made it nearly impossible for Immigration and Customs Enforcement to remove them. His policies have largely restricted the ability of ICE to detain and remove the population of illegal aliens. ICE removals dropped from more than 267,000 in FY19 to less than 60,000 in FY21 and 70,000 in 22. The FY23 numbers were better, but were still more than 40,000 fewer than the lowest year of the last administration, which largely occurred in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Criminals as a percentage of all ICE arrests went from around 90% in FY 2020 to just 43% in FY 23. The Secretary is not even living up to his own flawed standards that supposedly prioritize threats to public safety. The former sector chief in San Diego told us in May of 2023 that he didn't think the consequences of being removed from the country was being utilized enough to deter illegal immigration. Even Texas Democrat Mr. Cuellar has said, and I quote, "If you don't detain people, If you don't send people back, then the border becomes a speed bump, end quote. On top of all this, upon entering office, Secretary Mayorkas immediately began dismantling effective policies that had secured the southwest border, despite being warned by experienced border security personnel of the consequences that would result. That, coupled with his consistent decision to double down on his own unlawful policies, indicates an intentionality to this crisis. And I must note with great emphasis, these are not simple policy differences. This is a years-long pattern of refusing to enforce the laws passed by Congress. Our investigation also uncovered the fact that Secretary Mayorkas has violated the authority of his office. Secretary Mayorkas has directed the department to create numerous new unlawful mass parole programs that have allowed an unprecedented number of individuals to enter our country who otherwise would have no lawful basis to be here, and to incentivize migrants to make the dangerous and sometimes deadly travel to our southern border. He has also effectively told ICE officers not to do their job in enforcing America's immigration laws. According to his own guidance to ICE, and I quote, "The fact an individual is removable should not alone be the basis of an enforcement action against them," end quote. And quote, "Our personnel should not rely on the fact of conviction," end quote, "for a flatly deportable crime, but must consider," quote, "mitigating factors that ameliorate in favor of declining enforcement action," end quote. He has even overseen the reckless and irresponsible use of federal law enforcement personnel to sweep under the rug the mess he's made at the southwest border. Border Patrol agents from the northern border have been deployed to the southwest border to assist in processing and releasing illegal aliens into the interior. Hundreds of law enforcement professionals from Homeland Security investigations have been pulled from serious investigations like sex crimes, child exploitation, and other atrocities to perform administrative functions at the border. One whistleblower claimed that his team was told to shut down its investigations and were then sent to the border to make sandwiches. The Secretary has abused his authority and put Americans at risk. Secretary Mayorkas has repeatedly lied to the American people and to the United States Congress. Our investigation uncovered more than 100 instances where Secretary Mayorkas misled the public. Notably, he claimed in April 2022 hearing to have operational control of the southwest border as defined by federal statute. This was false. He then told another lie by claiming in subsequent hearings that he does not use the statutory definition of operational control, despite doing so in that 2022 hearing. Watch for yourself.
Will you testify under oath right now? Do we have operational control, yes or no?
Yes, we do. And
we have operational control of the borders.
Yes, we do. And Congressman, we are working to...
Listen what operational control defined. In this section, the term operational control means the prevention of all unlawful entries into the United States, including entries by terrorists, other unlawful aliens, instruments of terrorism, narcotics, and other contraband. Do you stand behind your testimony that we have operational control in light of this definition?
And Congressman, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security would have said the same thing in 2020 and in 2019.
That's the definition of operational control.
Based upon the definition you have, sir, up there, no.
We don't have operational control.
No, sir.
With respect to the definition of operational control, I do not use the definition that appears in the Secure Fence Act.
Do you admit that your policies have led the country farther away from operational control of the border as defined by the Congress?
Congressman, no, I do not.
If you will recall when you testified here in front of me when I asked that question, when you very clearly stated, we do have operational control. When presented with the actual definition of operational control, you didn't hesitate. You said, I do. And you, in fact, then referred back and said, I believe that my predecessors would have said the same thing. You looked straight at the American people, straight at me, straight at every person on this committee, and said, we have operational control. Why?
Congressman, 2 points. One, you did not let me complete my answer. Two.
Hold on. Or give me your second point. Go ahead.
Thank you. Two, the Secure Fence Act defines operational control as not a single individual crosses the border.
I'm aware. I read it, and I read it to you, and you read it, and in fact, you said, I do. You didn't hesitate. You didn't say, I do. I need to explain what I mean by I do. You said I do over and over again.
Secretary Mayorkas told this very committee in September 2021, and I quote, "The border is no less secure than it was previously," end quote. CBP recorded more than 192,000 encounters at our border that month alone, compared to around 58,000 the prior September. It was clear the border was not secure, so why did he mislead Congress? Another video, please.
Is the border more secure under your leadership than when you started?
Congressman, the border is secure. We're executing our plan, and I've been very clear and unequivocal in that regard.
Mr. Secretary, the question is the border more secure now under your leadership?
Congressman, it is no less secure than it was previously.
We have a record number of retirements, historic level of narcotics that have come across the border, and you still stand by your statement, yes or no, that the border is secure?
Yes.
He even stood at the White House podium in September 21 and falsely accused mounted Border Patrol agents in the Del Rio sector of whipping illegal aliens crossing the border. Earlier that same day, DHS emails showed that his staff had informed him that an eyewitness said no whipping occurred, yet he advanced the narrative at the highest levels anyway. One sector chief told us, and I quote, "We never whipped anybody. It was never really cleared up, and that takes a toll on our agents," end quote. Please play the video.
We are very troubled by what we have seen. One cannot weaponize a horse to aggressively attack a child. We know that those images painfully conjured up the worst elements of our nation's ongoing battle against systemic racism. First of all, the images, as I expressed earlier, the images horrified us in terms of what they suggest and what they conjure up in terms of not only our nation's history, but unfortunately the fact that that page of history has not been turned entirely. And that means that there is much work to do, and we are very focused on doing it.
An email obtained through a records request reveals that DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas was privately alerted by DHS officials that the whipping narrative behind the infamous horseback Border Patrol photos wasn't true. But at a press conference hours later, Mayorkas didn't stop or dispute that narrative.
This is just a taste of Secretary Mayorkas' misconduct. However, I want to close by reminding everyone that we're here today not only because House Republicans are determined to hold Secretary Mayorkas accountable, but because more than 200 House Democrats voted on November the 13th to refer articles of impeachment to our committee. We're now acting in a bipartisan way, I suppose, in taking up those very articles. And I briefly want to make it clear to the American people. Secretary Mayorkas' refusal to follow the law is sufficient grounds for impeachment proceedings. The constitutional history is overwhelmingly clear on this subject. The founders designed impeachment not just to remove officials engaged in criminal behavior, but those guilty of such gross incompetence that their conduct had endangered their fellow Americans, betrayed the public trust, or represented a neglect of duty. According to one scholar, there is, and I quote, "a settled understanding beyond dispute that impeachable offenses are not limited to prosecutable crimes. Rather, the framers of the Constitution understood, and the House of Representatives has consistently concluded, that the impeachment power reaches all manner of gross misconduct in office that does serious harm to the U.S. political system, the U.S. constitutional order, or the people of the country. The actions, policies, and statements of Secretary Mayorkas easily meet the standards," end quote. Over the next few hours, you might hear a lot about process and procedure, and after a thorough year-long investigation, this committee is following the Constitution and procedure as directed by the House's vote this past November. Make no mistake, attacks on the integrity of the process are meant to distract you from the deadly consequences of our open border. unprecedented cartel control of our southwest border with record amounts of fentanyl flooding across between ports of entry and into our communities, killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. Over 300 individuals on the terrorist watch list apprehended illegally crossing the southwest border since FY 2021, compared to just 14 from FY 2017 to 2020. Families devastated by violent criminal aliens who have committed murder, rape, and assault, to say nothing of the vehicular crimes committed. CBP and ICE personnel losing faith in their mission. They and their families bearing the brunt of this onslaught at the border. The human costs of this crisis are very real. The dollar costs of this crisis have been astronomical as well. New York City alone projects that it will have to spend $12 billion dealing with the flow of illegal aliens into the city by 2025. And it is even cutting the police force to pay for it. One county in Texas had to cut salaries to afford burials and cremations of illegal aliens found dead in their jurisdiction. These costs will be felt for years to come. As I stated when we started this investigation almost a year ago, we will follow the facts. We have done just that, and the facts have led us here. I look forward to the testimonies of these distinguished attorneys general who have watched this crisis play out unabated in their states. For the sake of our homeland security and the well-being of the people of the United States, Secretary Mayorkas must be held accountable. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in April, before this committee even began its so-called impeachment inquiry, Chairman Green promised donors at a campaign event that he'd bring an impeachment case against Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas. According to a recording of his comments obtained by the media, the chairman went on to tell those deep-pocket contributors to, quote, get the popcorn, and, quote, it's going to be fun. The chairman may have thought that only those in the campaign event would hear his remarks, but the truth has a way of coming out. His promise to a room full of donors tell the American people all they need to know about why Republicans are hell-bent on impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. The promise of impeachment was made at a campaign event, and shortly afterwards, Republicans began their so-called investigation into Secretary Mayorkas. It is now campaign season, and Republicans recently rolled out their impeachment proceedings against Secretary like a pre-planned, predetermined political stunt it is. This is not a legitimate impeachment. Republicans want to throw political red meat to their base and keep that campaign cash coming. They know their already razor-thin majority is slipping away and think impeaching Secretary Mayorkas, even though there's absolutely no basis for it, will keep them in control of the House. Republicans certainly aren't going to win votes based on their abysmal legislative record. This has been the most unproductive, dysfunctional Congress in memory. They kicked their own speaker out and then couldn't agree on a new one. They paralyzed the House for weeks while they fought among themselves. They've struggled to keep the government funding and are continually on the verge of shutting it down. A member of their party was expelled for lying about practically everything in his life. Extreme MAGA Republicans have created this impeachment circus sideshow, in part to try to distract from their own failures. They took their sideshow on the road recently, traveling to the border to stand behind a podium, making canned speeches and posing for photo ops. But for all their border security bluster, Republicans oppose funding necessary to secure the border. They tried to cut money from Customs and Border Protection personnel and have refused to take up the president's supplemental funding requests. Chairman Green himself recently penned an op-ed saying, and I quote, "Not another dime to DHS," unquote. until the Republican border bill is signed into law, even though he knows full well that disastrous bill has absolutely zero chance of being enacted. It should be unthinkable that a chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security would threaten to defund DHS, but that's exactly what happened. This is funding our frontline border and immigration agencies' need to better secure the border. Republicans have tried to excuse their opposition to border funding by claiming that Border Patrol doesn't want more funding, but that is blatantly false. In interviews with the committee, Border Patrol chiefs unequivocally supported more resources. Republicans know that. They were in the room, and they have the transcripts. But let me refresh their memory. Jason Owens, currently the chief of the Border Patrol, said, "We always need more agents." Chief Modlin in Tucson, an agency, "We need a lot more people." From Chief Heike in San Diego, "We always need resources and technology." From Chief Bovino in El Centro, "The additional resources is the correct technology assist with control of the border." And finally, from Chief Chavez in El Paso, "Providing support for critical positions and resources by Congress really does impact positively the deployment of agents to the front line." Every one of these chiefs told the committee that having more resources would help them better secure the border. Republicans go to the border in dress pants and polo shirts to pose for pictures, but then leave the hard-working agents in uniform and work boots behind without the resources they asked for. Democrats want to give border agents what they need to secure the border, and Republicans do not. The truth is, securing the border isn't really the Republicans' top concern. If it was, they'd provide the people with boots on the ground at the border what they need to get the job done. Republicans would rather exploit a challenging policy issue for their own perceived political gain. Republicans disagree with the Biden administration's border and immigration policies. They're angry that this administration won't take babies from their moms or put kids in cages like the last administration. You cannot impeach a cabinet secretary because you don't like the president's policies. Let me say that again. You cannot impeach a cabinet secretary because you don't like a president's policies. That's not what impeachment's for. That's not what the Constitution says. Republicans are willing to do grave damage to the Constitution they claim to hold dear because they think it will benefit them politically. And in doing so, they are targeting Secretary Mayorkas, a public servant who spent his distinguished 30-year career serving our country as a federal prosecutor and in leadership positions across the Department of Homeland Security. The facts show Secretary Mayorkas is doing his job across the department's many critical Homeland Security missions, including border security and immigration enforcement. Despite what Republicans would have Americans believe, Secretary Mayorkas is enforcing immigration law. According to a recent analysis by the Cato Institute, someone who crosses the border under the current administration is more likely to be removed from the U.S. than someone who crossed under former President Trump. Republicans don't care about that. This impeachment sham clearly isn't about facts. It's not about the law. It's about pure and simple politics. Just look at those whose impeachment resolutions have been referred to this committee. Consider what kind of backroom deals Republican leadership must have made with the most extreme MAGA members. Or as one Republican member recently put it, and I quote, "We are simply accommodating our least sensible conference members." I certainly agree. Democrats are doing everything they can to hold the line against Republican chaos. Democrats want to strengthen border security. We want to keep fentanyl off the streets. We want to keep communities safe. This circus sideshow impeachment does none of that. Mr. Chairman, let's drop this baseless impeachment and start doing the real work of securing the homeland for the American people. Before I yield back, however, Mr. Chairman, I have some parliamentary inquiries.
You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, isn't it true that there is no language in either Rule 10 or Rule 11 that grants the Committee on Homeland Security jurisdiction over the impeachment of any federal officer?
That is not a valid parliamentary inquiry. You need to state the rule and how it relates to this proceeding.
That's why it's an inquiry, because I'm referencing either Rule 10 or Rule 11 that grants the Committee of Homeland Security jurisdiction over impeachment of any officer.
There was a vote on the House floor, actually the motion made by the Democrats, to move impeachment articles to this committee. That trumps the rules, and it passed the House floor, and we are proceeding in accordance with the demands of the United States House of Representatives by vote of the members.
For the parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman is recognized.
Is the chair aware that of the 5 resolutions impeaching Secretary Mayorkas introduced in the House so far this Congress, just one, House Resolution 863, has been referred to the Committee of Homeland Security, and that 4 others have been referred by the Speaker to the Committee on Judiciary?
Again, I need to know the rule that you think this is in violation of, so it's not a correct parliamentary inquiry.
I didn't understand your ruling.
Not a valid parliamentary inquiry.
Further parliamentary inquiry, Mr.
Gentleman is
Chairman.
recognized.
Would the chair inform the committee of which rule or precedent supports the idea that the motion to refer overrides House rules on committee jurisdiction, particularly over a constitutional matter that should have been referred to the Committee on Judiciary?
That is not a valid parliamentary inquiry.
Further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is recognized.
Has the full House authorized this impeachment inquiry, such as it did on January 14th, 1876, for the investigation of then Secretary of War William W. Belknap, or such as the House did on December 13, 2023, for the investigation of President Biden?
Again, not a valid parliamentary inquiry. Of representatives voted to send this to this committee.
Further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is recognized.
Is the chair aware that the Committee on the Judiciary adopted internal rules of procedure for the conduct of its impeachment inquiry of ex-President Trump in 2019? And does the chair intend to follow suit and adopt additional committee rules to ensure due process for Secretary Mayorkas in this as yet unauthorized inquiry?
Again, not a valid parliamentary inquiry.
Further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is recognized.
And in reference to the Secretary's right to due process, I have the following parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Does the committee intend to follow the Secretary to be represented by counsel during these impeachment proceedings?
The committee will follow the rules of the House on that measure.
So do I understand that Secretary Mayorkas will be allowed counsel?
The committee will follow the rules of the House on that.
For the parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is recognized.
Does the committee intend to allow the Secretary's counsel to be present at all hearings and deposition?
The committee will follow the rules of the House.
Additional inquiry.
The gentleman is recognized.
Does the committee intend to allow the Secretary's counsel to present evidence and object to the admission of evidence?
The committee will follow the rules of the House.
Is that a no?
The committee will follow the rules of the House.
So, do the rules allow it? That's my point.
We will follow the rules of the House as they are written, and the question isn't pertinent to this committee hearing today.
Well, I think we'll get to that at some point, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to go on the record in pursuit of this is that when former President Trump had impeachment matters brought before, Senator Lindsey Graham made sure that he was afforded counsel and questions and everything. And I'm just trying to make sure that we follow some kind of order in that.
As I stated, Mr. Ranking Member, we will follow the rules of the House.
All right, thank you. For the parliamentary inquiry, does the committee intend to allow the Secretary's counsel to call and cross-examine witnesses?
Again, the committee will follow the rules of the House.
For the parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is recognized.
Does the committee intend to give the Secretary's counsel access to and the ability to respond to the evidence added by the committee?
The committee will follow all of the rules of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today, and I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Knudsen, Austin Knudsen was sworn in as Montana's 25th Attorney General on January the 4th, 2021. Prior to that, he was elected to the Montana House of Representatives in 2010. From 2015 to 2019, he served as the Speaker of the Montana House of Representatives. Gentner Drummond was sworn in as Oklahoma's 19th Attorney General on January the 9th, 2023. Mr. Drummond's law experience spans nearly 30 years and includes service as an Assistant District Attorney in Pawnee and Osage counties, and as an attorney in private practice. Andrew Bailey was sworn in as the 44th Attorney General of the state of Missouri on January the 3rd, 2023. Mr. Bailey is a veteran of the United States Army, in which he served in combat as a commissioned officer following the terrorist attacks of September 11. Mr. Frank Bowman is the University of Missouri's Curator's Distinguished Professor Emeritus and Floyd R. Gibson Missouri Endowed Professor of Law Emeritus at the University of Missouri School of Law. He has also taught at Georgetown University Law Center, Washington and Lee University, Gonzaga University, Indiana University's McKinney School of Law, Wake Forest University, and the University of Denver. And in spring of 2023, was visiting fellow at Oxford University's Rothermere American Institute. I thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I now recognize Mr. Knudsen for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the distinguished committee. My name is Austin Knudsen, Montana Attorney General. As the Attorney General and Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the state of Montana, I'm grateful for this committee's attention to how Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas' failed leadership has impacted states like Montana. The southern border certainly presents a difficult challenge for any administration, but Secretary Mayorkas and the Biden administration have absolutely poured gasoline on this fire. The southern border and the drugs flowing across it into communities large and small across our nation are ultimately the reason that I am the Attorney General of Montana today. I'm from rural Montana, where I was a private practice attorney until two drug dealers sped past my kids' school, one shooting at the other out his vehicle window in broad daylight. After that incident, I became our elected county prosecutor, where I saw what I thought were the absolute worst things possible. Babies born addicted to drugs, kids thrown into foster care because their parents would rather buy drugs than take care of them, young girls sexually assaulted by family members on drugs, people murdered over $20 drug deals gone wrong. So to say that I was encouraged by the previous administration's progress in securing our nation's border is an understatement. It's also an understatement to say that I was horrified to see this administration under Secretary Mayorkas' leadership begin to erase that progress and systematically dismantle policies and programs meant to secure our borders. The most devastating impact of the open border on Montana has been the massive quantities of Mexican cartel fentanyl and methamphetamine. In 2020, drug task forces in Montana seized 6,663 dosage units of fentanyl. In 2021, the first year of Secretary Mayorkas' watch at the border, that quantity exploded tenfold to 61,000 dosage units of fentanyl. In 2022, Montana tripled that, seizing nearly 190,000 dosage units of cartel fentanyl. The numbers aren't finalized yet for 2023, but I can tell you that as of the third quarter of 2023, Montana is on track to have seized nearly 500,000 dosage units of fentanyl and another 200 pounds of meth. And the cartels trafficked 100% of that fentanyl and meth across the southern border. In just 1 week during March 2022, 17 people on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation overdosed on fentanyl. 4 of them died. I spoke with a woman later that year from the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, which is where I'm from. She was raising her grandkids because both of her sons were killed in 2 separate fentanyl overdose incidents. Nationwide, Indigenous people suffer the highest rate of fentanyl overdoses. In Montana, the opioid overdose death rate among Native Americans is twice that of white people. The devastation of Secretary Mayorkas' refusal to faithfully execute the laws goes beyond the deaths it causes and the anguished families left to pick up pieces. These drugs cause people to do absolutely unspeakable things. A suspect in a current drug case in Montana was taking delivery of drugs that were being supplied directly from the cartels in Mexico. She kept her minor daughter living in a yard shed and allowed the man delivering those drugs to sexually assault her daughter as part of that drug deal. In another case last year, a young mother who was homeless was able to finally find a bedroom in a house, not knowing that that room had been recently occupied by a fentanyl user. Shortly after taking residence, that mother found her 11-month-old child not breathing. Fortunately, medical and law enforcement personnel responded quickly enough to administer naloxone before the fentanyl from the prior occupant killed that infant child. The Trump administration overcame fierce opposition at every turn and was able to gain control of our southern border as no previous administration could. But all of that progress has been destroyed. Secretary Mayorkas is the architect of that destruction. The American people are watching. They know that our border was secure just a few years ago. They see the devastation metastasizing in our communities from drugs and human trafficking. The conclusion is clear. Secretary Mayorkas has violated his oath, and I urge this body to impeach. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Knudsen. I now recognize Mr. Drummond for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate today in this hearing on this critical issue. I am Gettner Drummond, and I was elected Oklahoma's Attorney General in 2022. As the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of Oklahoma, it is my duty to protect the people of my state. I'm here to testify about the dangers my citizens face due to a porous border and the failure of our federal government to enforce its laws. In the early evening of November 20, 2022, law enforcement responded to a quadruple homicide after a Chinese national allegedly entered a garage on a 10-acre marijuana farm in rural Oklahoma. According to investigators, the assailant killed 3 men, execution style, with gunshots to the back of their head, and 1 woman with 2 shots to her abdomen. The carnage of that day is but one tragic example of a failed system plagued by failing leadership. Throughout Oklahoma, law enforcement comes into contact daily with foreign nationals who have entered our country illegally or who remain here illegally or both. This is all too common in Oklahoma's illegal marijuana grow operations. The voters of Oklahoma legalized medical marijuana in 2018. While that legalization led to the legitimate cannabis business-related businesses throughout our state, organized criminals have overtaken the industry. Our law enforcement partners report that the foreign nationals most often involved in these illegal enterprises come from China and Mexico. The one thing these criminals have in common is that they have no regard for our laws or public safety. Criminal illegal immigrants are not content with growing only black market marijuana. They also produce and distribute fentanyl, and they engage in sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Oklahoma's law enforcement community fights a constant battle against these evils. The Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, and scores of local law enforcement agencies deserve much praise for their great and heroic efforts. While there have been many great successes, the ongoing border crisis ensures a never-ending flood of illegal foreign nationals who continue to perpetrate crimes that endanger our people. When I was sworn in as Attorney General, I pledged to the people of my state that I would do everything in my power to protect them from these dangerous criminals. I petitioned our legislature for greater resources and broader authority to combat the threat. They responded with millions of dollars for equipment and personnel, and they granted my office more power to fight this criminal epidemic being fueled by our border crisis. In response, I established the Organized Crime Task Force, the first of its kind for Oklahoma, and it is needed primarily because federal officials have failed to enforce the laws and to secure our border. In the short 7 months since its creation, the Organized Crime Task Force has investigated and is prosecuting more than 50 complex, multi-jurisdictional criminal cases. The vast majority of these cases involve Mexican or Chinese drug syndicates. These illegal foreign actors burden my state with additional costs that cannot be fully quantified. For instance, the Oklahoma Department of Corrections reports that it is currently housing more than 500 illegal immigrants convicted of various violent crimes. Before those criminal aliens were sent to the Department of Corrections, they were in custody of our local jails, which have their own costs for housing. Likewise, there is a significant cost for law enforcement in the investigating of these crimes and for the prosecutors who prosecute them. The unsecure border contributes to costs beyond the criminal justice system as well. While it is not possible to ascertain the exact amount of the cost, it is easy to understand the magnitude. Illegal immigration costs Oklahoma taxpayers more than $750 million each year with a minimal offset return. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I believe it is time for accountability. The people of Oklahoma don't deserve to live under constant threat from criminal foreign nationals. We don't deserve to have our communities flooded with illegal drugs that were smuggled across an unsecure border. And we don't deserve to have our loved ones ripped away by those same drugs. I ask you to remember the people of Oklahoma as you deliberate. Remember the murder victims, remember the drug overdose victims, and the families who mourn them. And of course, please remember the law enforcement officers who risk their lives every day to protect us from it all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Drummond. I now recognize Mr. Bailey for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. My understanding of border security comes from direct, hands-on experience securing a nation's border. It was earned on a barren desert battlefield half a world away from the turret of an M2 Bradley fighting vehicle. In 2005, as a newly minted second lieutenant in the United States Army, my platoon deployed to the Nineveh province, Iraq, under the command of then Colonel H.R. McMaster. It was tasked with securing the border between Iraq and Syria. Our mission was simple: close the border. And that's exactly what we did. We did not capture people and release them into the interior of the country. We did not hand out citations and ask individuals to report back in 10 years. No, we closed the border to ensure the country was safe. Since 2021, more than 8 million illegal immigrants have entered the United States, and that is more than the population of my home state of Missouri. These numbers are not an accident. There is only one reason 8 million people illegally cross a sovereign nation's border: because they know that they can get away with it. And why wouldn't they? In the last 3 years of Secretary Mayorkas' reign, there has been an orchestrated lack of enforcement of our nation's immigration laws. He has failed to do that which is most fundamental to his mission: protect our border. That failure has not only led to today's impeachment proceeding, it has given rise to an unprecedented level of state actions necessary to fill the vacuum created by the Secretary's refusal to do his job. I'd like to highlight for you a few of the actions my office has taken as we fight to secure the southern border. One of those is our fight to force him to finish President Trump's border wall. In an interview last Wednesday on CNN, Secretary Mayorkas stated, "We need additional resources and we need them now." Our lawsuit proves he already has funding, he just refuses to use it. In fiscal year 2020, Congress appropriated funds explicitly for the purpose of constructing barrier systems at our southern border to keep unauthorized individuals out of our country. In the appropriation, Congress explicitly stated the money shall only be available for the construction of barrier systems along the southwest border. Secretary Mayorkas and his administration refused to comply with Congress's command. Missouri immediately filed suit. DHS attempted to argue we did not have standing to challenge its refusal to use the funds, but the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that states can indeed bring such a challenge. That ruling cleared the way for our lawsuit against the Secretary's refusal to finish President Trump's border wall, and it allowed the lawsuit to move forward. So while we battle in court over Secretary Mayorkas' refusal to use taxpayer dollars in the manner Congress explicitly prescribed, we have little sympathy for his pleas for more resources. Rather than find ways to secure our border, Secretary Mayorkas has been busy enacting policies to make it easier to enter our country illegally. We filed suit again against Secretary Mayorkas for allowing hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants to be paroled into the United States every year. Parole allows non-citizens to physically enter and remain in the United States for up to 2 years or even longer while their application is reviewed without lawful status. We also filed suit to halt Secretary Mayorkas' attempt to implement a rule that redefined what had previously been considered an illegal border crossing as a lawful pathway. Rather than acknowledge the root cause of the influx of illegal immigrants pouring over our border, the Secretary tried to define the problem away by simply making something that was once illegal something legal without congressional authorization. Mayorkas' process would allow vast numbers of illegal immigrants to enter the country and receive instant work authorization under bogus asylum claims. Secretary Mayorkas has enacted illegal policies that are akin to posting a "come in, we're open" sign along the southern border. Without taking responsibility for the consequences of his actions, states are then forced to bear the enormous cost of Secretary Mayorkas' failure. The states should not need to do the federal government's job for them. Secretary Mayorkas swore an oath to faithfully execute the laws of our land. In Missouri, we remove officials who do not do their jobs because we have seen firsthand the catastrophic toll it takes on entire communities. My office was forced to take action to remove a Soros-backed prosecuting attorney from office for her refusal to do her job that resulted in the killing and maiming of countless Missourians. Since we took action, order has been restored to the city of St. Louis. It is rightful for Congress to consider removing a government official who refuses to do his job for the same reason: to restore order. We have reached a point of no return. We're doing everything we can at the state level to rectify this disaster, but Congress has a role to play for accountability. While we battle in the nation's courts, Congress must use every tool at its disposal to obtain accountability for the American people. I thank the committee for its time and welcome its questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. I now recognize Mr. Bowman for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, I'm honored to address this committee, and I'm also pleased to share the witness table with three distinguished elected officials, one of whom, immediately to my right, Mr. Bailey, I last remember seeing around 2011 as a second-year law student in my evidence class at Mizzou. As Attorney General of Missouri, he's surely come up in the world. Congratulations to you from an old professor. I, on the other hand, remain simply an old professor. I understand this to be the first in a series of hearings on whether constitutional grounds exist to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. The testimony so far has focused on the performance of Secretary Mayorkas and the Biden administration relating to immigration policy and enforcement. I'm not an expert on immigration policy. I will not comment on it here. I have, however, been studying constitutional standards for impeachment for over 25 years. I've written numerous articles and a book on the history of impeachment from its origins in England in 1376 through the two impeachments of President Trump. My subject, therefore, will be the constitutional standard for impeaching a cabinet officer. The key point about impeachment in our Constitution is that it is not supposed to be a routine tool to resolve ordinary public policy debates, even very passionate ones. Debates between political parties or between one house of Congress and the executive branch. It is instead a measure of last resort, reserved, as one framer put it, for great and dangerous offenses. In other words, for official misconduct which is extraordinarily serious in degree and critically of a type that corrupts or subverts governmental processes or the constitutional order itself. That the framers intended impeachment to be rare is obvious from their decision that conviction requires 2/3 of the Senate. That they intended to rule it out as a weapon of ordinary political debate is plain from how they defined impeachable conduct. The Constitution provides that the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. A cabinet secretary is a civil officer subject to impeachment, but a cabinet secretary, like the President, is not impeachable unless he's proven to have committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. There's no suggestion that I'm aware of that Secretary Mayorkas has committed either treason or bribery. Hence, any article of impeachment against him must establish that he committed high crimes and misdemeanors. The framers chose the English parliamentary term of art, high crimes and misdemeanors, rather than other possible terms like maladministration, because they wanted a flexible term that could reach unanticipated new forms of grave official misconduct, but equally and critically because they did not want an impeachment that would be the equivalent of a vote of no confidence in modern parliamentary systems, a vote that could remove the president or other executive branch officials between elections whenever the legislature disapproves of administration policy. For over 2 centuries, students of the Constitution have universally agreed, in the words of the great impeachment scholar Charles Black, that whatever may be the grounds for impeachment and removal, dislike of a president's policy is certainly not one of them. To be properly impeachable, official conduct must meet a very high threshold of seriousness. It must also be of a type that corrupts and subverts the political and governmental process, and it ought to be plainly wrong regardless of legal technicalities. The most commonly encountered categories of impeachable conduct are official corruption, abuse of power, betrayal of the nation's foreign policy interests, and subversion of the Constitution. There is no serious allegation of which I'm aware that the Secretary has done any of those things. Now, some might mischaracterize the Secretary's implementation of the President's policy priorities as an abuse of power, but impeachable abuse of power involves employing the powers of office for illegal or illegitimate ends, particularly to gain personal, political, or financial advantage, to benefit personal or political allies, or to injure political or personal enemies, and especially when the abusive exercise of official power undermines constitutional values. Following the policy directives of one's elected superior in pursuit of that superior's policy aims is simply not an impeachable abuse of power. Finally, impeachment of a cabinet secretary over policy agreements is not only contrary to long-established constitutional understanding, but useless as a practical matter. If the official actions of the officer are in accord with the directives of his elected superior, the president, removing the secretary changes nothing. If members of this committee disapprove of the Biden administration's immigration and border policies, the Constitution gives this Congress a wealth of legislative powers to change them. Impeachment is not one of those powers.
The leader disagrees.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. This is for the three attorneys general. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has failed to enforce or has subverted laws passed by the United States Congress? And we'll start and go left to right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
He has failed to perform his duties and is culpably inefficient.
Has he failed to enforce laws passed by the U.S. Congress?
He has.
Yes, sir. Secretary Mayorkas is acting in violation of the law and in violation of constitutional order by negating Congress's appropriations authority and directives in the appropriations bill and undermining the rule of law by perverting the plain text of the statutes as it relates to the parole process and its promulgation of the circumvention rule.
Thank you. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas, again, we're going to hit the three of you, do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has defied court orders issued by the United States courts, which I can cite if you want me to, but I'm sure you're probably aware of them? Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has defied court orders issued by the courts, federal courts?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Yes, and it should never come to having to go to court against Secretary Mayorkas because he should be following the laws enacted by this body.
Thank you. In testimony to Chip Roy before the House of Representatives, you saw some of the video there, the Secretary said yes to the question of whether DHS possessed operational control of the southwest border as defined by the Secure Fence Act. I might add, act, meaning the Congress passed it. In subsequent testimony to the Senate, Secretary Mayorkas stated that no one has ever had operational control of the border and that he does not use that definition of operational control as defined by the Secure Fence Act. Given these statements, do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas misled Congress while under oath in describing DHS's operational control of the border? Again, gentlemen, the three of you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do.
I believe that he politicized his answer and failed to be authentic.
Yes, absolutely.
Attorney General Merrick Garland acknowledged in testimony to the United States Senate that drug cartels were exploiting the current Mayorkas policies in order to traffic humans and harmful drugs into the United States. Secretary Mayorkas on March 28, 23 stated that he was unaware of this. Now, we of course informed him, now armed with this knowledge, Mayorkas continues the same policies, in fact doubling down with newer policies that even exacerbate the same horrible outcomes. Do you think Secretary Mayorkas is doing this with full knowledge that these cartels are exploiting his policies?
Mr. Chairman, there's no doubt there's ample evidence out there that human trafficking and drug trafficking are increasing at an exponential level at the southern border, yes.
And Mr. Chairman, based on my testimony today and the facts that are well known by the Secretary, there's a porous border that's feeding constantly illegal actors in Oklahoma.
Ms. Bailey.
Yes, his unlawful behavior as it relates to the circumvention rule and subversion of the parole process exacerbate and encourage the cartels and cede control of the border to the cartels in ways unimaginable prior to these policy positions.
Thank you. Where impeachment is concerned, the scale is very important. How would you describe the scale or comparable size of this border crisis based on your law enforcement experience? And we'll start with Mr. Knudsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on my prior prosecuting experience, I can tell you since 2020, the fentanyl and human trafficking specifically, fentanyl and methamphetamine trafficking have increased in my state. There's no other word than meteoric. I can tell you about the first fentanyl case that I prosecuted in 2019. That was a relatively small amount by today's standards, but at the time we thought that was a large bust. And again, that was in 2019. Our seizure numbers from our various drug task forces, our various federal partnerships bear that out categorically. Fentanyl in Montana is by far our largest public safety issue, and it's just exploded under this administration. Our seizure numbers bear that out.
I'm going to go ahead and sort of interrupt my own question because my time is running out. I know Mr. Bowman mentioned the term great and dangerous threat to the United States. I'll ask the last two of you, do you feel that the hundreds of thousands who've died to fentanyl overdose, the crime that's exponentially increased, the increase in terrorist activity, or terrorists coming across the southern border, do you think it's great and dangerous, Mr. Drim?
It is great and dangerous. We have collision between Chinese and Mexican cartels.
Mr. Bailey, very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. The Missouri State Highway Patrol, a single law enforcement agency in the state of Missouri last year, seized 12,500 grams of fentanyl. That's enough to kill every Missourian.
Thank you, and I yield. I now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've been on this committee since its inception and have served as a top Democrat since 2005. During that time, Democrats and Republicans have engaged in spirited debate over policy, both with each other and with various administrations. At the end of the day, however, we always came together to make the homeland more secure for the American people. This has been our committee's reputation, and as a point of pride for me and all my Republican counterparts, from chairs and ranking members. Today marks a dramatic shift from the committee's record of sensible bipartisan policymaking. We used to come together to resolve policy disputes, but now Republicans are trying to use the awesome power of impeachment instead. The Constitution doesn't let us do that. The Constitution requires high crimes and misdemeanors. Professor Bowman, has Secretary Mayorkas, in your opinion, committed high crimes and misdemeanors to meet that requirement?
Based on all the information available to me, I have not found any indication that he's committed high crimes and misdemeanors, no.
Thank you. Over the weekend, we observed the 3rd anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, during which thousands of angry Trump supporters who had whipped into a frenzy by Donald Trump marched from the White House to the Capitol to obstruct the democratic process. And let's be clear, those individuals were acting on the orders of Donald Trump, who told them, quote, "We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're going to not have a country anymore," unquote. That night, most of us were unified in our disgust over the attack on the Capitol and the democratic process. Almost immediately, however, that unity eroded. In the end, only 10 Republicans voted to impeach Donald Trump for engaging in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States. Professor Bowman, as a constitutional expert, would you agree that inciting an insurrection to obstruct a peaceful transfer of power is an impeachable offense?
I do agree, and I think it's notable that not only did 10 members of this body vote to impeach Donald Trump, but when the case went to trial in the Senate, 7 Republican members of the Senate voted for that precise proposition. There was indeed a majority for convicting Mr. Trump of high crimes and misdemeanors, albeit not the 2/3 majority that was required under the Constitution.
And yet only 10 Republicans voted to impeach Donald Trump for conduct that is clearly an impeachable offense. But today, Republicans are attempting to impeach Secretary Mayorkas where there are clearly no grounds. Mr. Chairman, this impeachment is a sham and the height of hypocrisy on the part of my colleagues across the aisle. I urge Republicans to put politics aside and get back to the work for the American people. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a solemn occasion, probably the most serious obligation we have in this committee, on this committee. The last time a cabinet member was impeached was during the administration of Ulysses S. Grant many years ago. In my experience, though, as a Deputy Attorney General for Criminal Justice, state of Texas, as a federal prosecutor charged with counterterrorism and national security, and as chairman of this very committee, I've never seen this border more out of control. Mayorkas took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. In my judgment, he has violated that oath. Federal law provides the government detain and remove aliens convicted of crimes and those who are issued removal orders by immigration courts. This is the very issue that my state took up on appeal to the Supreme Court. He has violated this. On day one, he rescinded Remain in Mexico Migrant Protection Protocol, direct cause and effect, opening the floodgates. I marked that provision up on my committee, Foreign Affairs. It's now part of H.R. 2. But he took that power away from his law enforcement officers. And I have to quote, I don't quote former Texas Congresswoman Barbara Jordan very often, but she said, quote, "For the system to be credible, people actually have to be deported at the end of the process." And let's look at the numbers. They speak for themselves. 8 million encounters under this administration, 2.3 aliens in the interior of the United States with no legal status, enough to fill up 13 states. Just last month, we had over 300,000 trying to get into the United States. Over 300 on the terror watch list have gotten into the United States. When I chaired this committee, that was a big red flag, and the FBI director said so when he testified as well. Over 200,000 Americans have died from fentanyl. I personally went to a funeral last Saturday. One of my children's friends died from Xanax laced with fentanyl. 200,000 Americans, that's more than triple the number of Americans who died in the Vietnam War, to put that into perspective. The Secretary has emboldened a criminal enterprise and the biggest human trafficking scheme in my lifetime. He terminated MPP. Chief Ortiz noted that had a direct cause and effect. And when Mayorkas went down to the border, they turned their backs on him because, quote, "Sir, you have turned your back on us." My state has spent almost $14 billion just this cycle. We've allocated $9.6 billion to Operation Lone Star. My governor bussed illegals to sanctuary cities and states around the country to showcase what we are experiencing, and you are as well in your states, every single day. And the damage was clear. The Supreme Court did note the damage, but said that this had to be resolved outside the courts. In other words, they said that Congress had to address this either through appropriations, oversight, and in Sam Alito's decision, yes, through impeachment. This is the legal justification for these proceedings. The founders believed impeachable offenses included corrupt administration, neglect of duty, and official misconduct. At the Constitutional Convention, they said this. Alexander Hamilton asserted abuse or violation of public trust was impeachable. Justice Story, Supreme Court, public office is a public trust, and a violation of public trust is sufficient. I find this to be a profound violation of public trust. Alexander Hamilton stated in Federalist Paper 65, the subjects of impeachment are a nature which may be denounced political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to society itself. My God, what about the injuries done to society that we've seen? To our three illustrious attorneys general, please tell me the injuries done to your societies back home, and do you think this secretary merits and that impeachment is warranted in this case?
Thank you, Representative. I think the most powerful statistic I can give you from my state is our confirmed state crime lab fentanyl overdose death rate. Since 2019, Montana's confirmed fentanyl overdose deaths have increased 1,700%. Congressman, I think that is the absolute strongest indicator. We know where these drugs are coming from. It's not a political statement of mine. It's not an opinion of mine to say that 100% of that fentanyl came from the Mexican drug cartels. We know that to be true. We get that from our federal partners in the DEA. We get that from all of our drug task forces, all the law enforcement agencies that are under my purview.
Just real quickly, General Drummond and Bailey, just very quickly.
We have witnessed a mass collusion between Chinese nationals coming through the southern border in concert with Mexican cartels.
1,500 fentanyl deaths, 43 children dead from accidental poisoning from exposure to fentanyl, $114 million borne by taxpayers and increased healthcare costs.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, the gentlelady from Texas, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for yielding. I almost don't know where to start, and certainly will find the 5 minutes to be underwhelming in terms of the time that I need. I do want to express my solemnity and humbleness and expression of appreciation for having the honor of serving on this committee, even in the midst of the horrific 9/11. It seems that this committee always rises to the occasion to be the problem solvers. And I clearly am someone who has lived the immigration story in Texas, and I would certainly have a different view than my friend and colleague who has just spoken about the actions that have been taken as children and families have been manipulated as if they are inhuman. I do think that one of the highest callings of this committee is, in fact, to do the bidding of solving the nation's immigration problems. And as a member of the Judiciary Committee, I have over the years introduced comprehensive immigration reform legislation year after year after year. And so I am certainly willing and able to be part of the solution for the 3 attorney generals, of which I am a lawyer, certainly served in capacities to realize the important work that you do. But I must join in the sadness of this day. The sadness of this day because it is not constitutionally grounded, it is not constitutionally sound, it is not going to save any lives at all, and there is nothing that you have put forward today that evidences in any way a impeachable offense by Secretary Mayorkas, the first immigrant to serve in this position. A dislike of the president's policy is not a basis for impeachment. A basis for impeachment is corruption, abuse of power, betrayal of the nation. And that is, of course, allegations. You, as witnesses, I am sorry to say, Mr. Chairman, have borne no testimony that indicates that Secretary Mayorkas has done any of that. So I thank the ranking member for his earlier eloquent words on this shameful, fraudulent impeachment inquiry, where we are not fixing the immigration issues that my constituents in Houston need. At the onset, I'm reminded of the words of the Representative Barbara Jordan, complete difference from what I heard her quoted before. I know that she did an excellent job in trying to frame the immigration issues of years past. My predecessor represented Houston like I do. She endorsed me, glad to say a mentor. Like her, my faith in the Constitution